So, the first keynote of the day, it's a very, very deep pleasure to today's keynote speaker, which is Professor Debbie Ging, and the first keynote will be the young people's exposure to harmful content and behavior online. So, really a few info about Debbie Ging. That will be the professor of the digital media and gender in the School of Communication at the Dublin City University, and she also teaches and research on gender, sexuality, and digital media. Debbie's research also addressed youth experience on gender-based and sexual abuse online, and educational intervention to tackle issues. So, Debbie, welcome here, and the chair is yours.
Thank you. Is this the clicker? Perfect. Just figuring out how to, oh. How does it go forward? Sorry, Carl. I should have tested it first. Ah. Perfect. Sorry about that. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to come and speak to you today. I feel like I'm going to bring the mood down a bit, so apologies for that, but then hopefully up again at the end. So you can see from the title of my presentation, Young People's Exposure to Harmful Content and Behaviour Online, that this is a fairly heavy topic, but on a slightly more positive note, there is a subheading to the presentation, which is, and what can we do about it? So yes, my work is primarily concerned with the dark side of the internet, and these are the kinds of studies that I've been involved in recent years. So as you can see, the focus is very much on harm in terms of the impact of social media on women and girls, on young people's experiences of gender-based and sexual abuse, gender hate online misogyny, male supremacism, etc. So not the jolliest of topics. And as we know, the online world is at best arbitrarily regulated and also heavily driven by the whims of algorithmic capitalism. Perhaps most importantly, the pace of technological progress means that we're constantly struggling to keep up in terms of government policy, legislation, platform governance, and basic digital literacy education. So this struggle is in itself so overwhelming sometimes that we can get fixated on very specific and alarming new phenomena, from catfishing and sextortion to figures like Andrew Tate and the promotion of eating disorders. And obviously these are really important issues, but there's a tendency sometimes to fixate, particularly in the mass media, on these kind of moral panic issues. And that's not to say that they're not things that we should be, concerned about. They absolutely are, but it's the framing of the issues that's problematic. And by the way, I include academic researchers in this kind of problem, in that there are literally so many new platforms and so many new phenomena that there's very little time for us to research them, much less to develop kind of bigger joined up thinking about these issues. So I would argue that in this sense, a lot of our work has become quite descriptive. We're simply trying to capture the characteristics and dynamics of new platforms sometimes, and new online communities and new behaviours, and having to kind of move on to the next thing without taking the time or having the time to really reflect on what's happening here at a kind of deeper level. So, as I say, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be alarmed or interested in these phenomena. We absolutely should. But we can't simply run around putting out ostensibly random fires all the time without joining the dots. And that's what I really want to talk about today, is how do we join the dots and understand a bigger more kind of joined up, contextualized picture here. We need to understand who or what is lighting the fires, what's causing the conditions that feed the fires, and most importantly, how we can prevent them. So obviously, in the understandable rush to address urgent social problems, these bigger philosophical, ethical, and social questions tend to get overlooked. And I would argue that it is very much in the interests of and to the benefit of both governments and the social media companies that so few people have so little time to dwell on these matters. So, here are some of the bigger questions that I think we often forget to ask. To what extent has the internet actually caused, facilitated, and or amplified these issues? Are we blaming the internet for phenomena that already exist? And has the internet merely revealed these issues or these problems to us? Is it even appropriate or useful to talk about the online world, excuse me, or the internet anymore? Should we just say instead, the world driven by digital capitalism? Because the offline-online dichotomy makes no sense anymore. There is no distinction. There is no real world, online world. We know this, right? It seems much more appropriate to me, perhaps, to think in terms of the human and the digital instead. All of our lives are entwined in digital capitalism, not just young people. And I think we hear this discourse quite a lot where the entire focus of concern is on young people and their engagement in social media, as if older people do not live and function, you know, in every aspect of their own daily lives through digital apps, etc. So by this logic, maybe the title of this presentation should be Young People's Exposure to Harmful Content and Behaviour in a World Driven by Digital Capitalism. So in case that's not enough questions, here's a few more. Who profits from our social media engagements? If we're providing all the content, why aren't we being paid? Or at least, why don't we have a say in how our data is used? What is techno-capitalism doing to the distribution of wealth in the world? Is it appropriate that privately owned tech corporations host what we now accept to be our public sphere? Why should we be doing education, public debate, etc., in spaces that are privately owned? Where has the sense of the public sphere gone? What's happened to that? So I think these are bigger, more important questions than some of the kind of symptoms that we see here. Let's look at the causes. So I'll come back to these questions at the end, but what I'm going to start by doing is to talk about some of the types of harmful content to which young people are exposed that I have seen in my research. So the purpose of this is not just to draw attention to some really concerning phenomena, although this is, of course, important, but it's also to afford us the opportunity to consider some of the deeper societal, structural, and economic contexts that have given rise to these phenomena. And from that, more nuanced, I would argue, and contextualized position to contemplate whether more radical or longer-term solutions are possible, in addition to the more immediate recommendations and solutions that we are also by necessity forced to call for. So let's go back to the 4 C's that the Commissioner mentioned, the 4 C's of online safety: content, contact, conduct, and commerce. These are helpful perspectives or lenses through which to understand young people's safety. But I would argue that considered in isolation, they don't really account for some very significant changes that have been brought about by new recommender platforms or recommender-driven platforms in recent years. So for example, when we talk about the 4th C, it's usually in the context of customized advertising that is age inappropriate, for example, or gender stereotypical, or encouraging of unhealthy body weight. or in relation to online gambling or financial scams. Not that these are not very serious problems. But recommender algorithms are now driving a much wider and more complex range of harms into the social media feeds of young people. And the line between commerce and extremist or problematic content is becoming increasingly blurred due to two key and related developments. The first of these is the explosion of TikTok during the COVID-19 pandemic. The second, the rise of influencer culture. So what we are seeing now is a new raft of digital entrepreneurs who are exploiting both the technological affordances of the recommender algorithm and the vulnerabilities of young people, boys in particular, to spread male supremacist, anti-feminist and anti-LGBTQ worldviews in the guise of advice about physical wellness, mental health and financial advice. These manfluencers, of which Andrew Tate is the most famous obviously, are making vast amounts of money, while at the same time promising boys and young men that they can also become rich if they break free of the matrix and determine their own destiny. A phenomenon which the blogger Alec Hamo has referred to as the Stoic industrial complex. The appeal of these manfluencers is not surprising, given widespread job insecurity, unemployment, rising property prices, and lack of social supports, the erosion of the social safety net under neoliberal capitalism. They also offer rebellious freedoms from the perceived constraints of what they perceive to be woke or PC culture, which are framed as demonizing men's natural instincts to be powerful and to dominate women. In this manosphere scheme of things, depression is framed as an emasculating weakness, and many of these influencers advise against therapy and medication, arguing that such indulgences are for women, who they argue experience different emotions to men. In reality, of course, these gurus are simply selling subscriptions to their businesses using pyramid selling schemes, and the micro-influencers who sign up are also vastly amplifying their videos on TikTok and YouTube Shorts. This is a kind of Hustlers University, the war room economic model that Andrew Tate has become so rich from. So in response to this issue, and because we were hearing a lot of anecdotal evidence from teachers, from students themselves, and from parents, we decided, or I conducted an experimental study with two postdoctoral students, postdoctoral researchers in Dublin City University. And the findings of this report were published earlier this year. You can access the report from the Anti-Bullying Centre website in DCU. So we tracked the content that was recommended to different types of fake male accounts by setting up 10 experimental or sock puppet accounts on 10 blank iPhones. So 5 on YouTube Shorts and 5 on TikTok. And on each of the platforms, we set up 2 types of account plus a control account. So we had a 16-year-old boy and an 18-year-old boy who were your average gender-typical guy looking for, stereotypical guy looking for stuff like gym, sports, video games, whatever. And then a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old who we called manosphere curious. In other words, they're actively seeking out popular manosphere content like Andrew Tate, anti-feminism, etc. And we watched about 3 hours of videos on each of these accounts, watched and recorded it. This is quite a lot of TikTok or YouTube short videos. And what we found was that all of the accounts, whether they were actually looking for manosphere content or whether they were looking for generic, kind of stereotypical male interest content, all of them were fed male supremacist, misogynistic, or other types of toxic content within the first 26 minutes of the experiment. But some were recommended this way quicker, in one case within the first 2 minutes of engagement. So in the case of YouTube Shorts, 61.5% of the total recommended content was coded as toxic. And in the case of the TikTok accounts, 34.7% of the total recommended content was toxic. And by toxic, we mean that it was either male supremacist, anti-feminist, misogynist, far-right, or conspiracy content. So the YouTube Shorts algorithm was much more reactive to the Manosphere Curious accounts. It fed them a lot more of that type of content, whereas the TikTok fed both types of account similar levels of toxic content, but also, interestingly, more far-right, anti-trans and conspiracy content than on YouTube Shorts. In other words, the TikTok algorithm was feeding them more of the same content, but it was also trying to drive them down different far-right rabbit holes, particularly anti-trans, which is obviously really concerning. And the other, I suppose, key finding was that the quantity of manosphere and toxic content increased exponentially. By the last round of the experiment, the vast majority of the content being recommended on the phones was toxic. In the case of TikTok, 76% of overall content, and in the case of YouTube Shorts, 78%, primarily falling into the male supremacist and anti-feminist categories. So we're not alone in doing this kind of experimental study. There's been a lot of other, or a growing number of similar studies in recent years which have produced very similar results. So for example, this Reset Australia study that was done on YouTube and YouTube Shorts in 2022, we used or adapted their methodology, and they actually helped us to develop our research design. So their findings were very similar. They were less extreme because this research wasn't done on TikTok, it was pre-TikTok. But they also found, in fact, they went in looking to see if young male users would be recommended far-right or fascist or anti-immigrant content. And they were surprised by their findings because they were being fed instead a fairly constant stream of anti-feminist and misogynist content instead. So their findings are quite similar to ours, but less extreme. Earlier this year, or sorry, last year, UCL and the University of Kent published a report about TikTok's promotion as well of misogynistic content to boys. So in this case, they used an algorithmic modeling study. It was semi-automated. It was a bigger, our approach was manual. They used a partly automated methodology. And they found that there was a 4-fold increase in the level of misogynistic content in the For You page of TikTok accounts over just 5 days on the platform. Again, that's slightly less than what we found, but arguably the algorithmic modeling that they used emulated the behavior of real users in a more realistic way. 2 major studies as well by Amnesty on TikTok report on mental health content again show that TikTok is driving self-harm and suicidal ideation content into the feeds of young people who are searching for advice on mental health. So in these studies, they used a combination of manually operated sock puppet accounts pretending to be young people in various locations worldwide, but they also used an automated method as well. So this is quite a large-scale global study. And it also concluded that children looking for mental health advice were served content which encouraged self-harm and suicidal ideation. A report as well by the Centre for Countering Digital Hate in 2022 found more or less the same. as did a small-scale experimental study that was carried out by an Irish journalist for a current affairs programme on the National Public Service broadcaster. So we're seeing in a number of experimental studies like this is very similar findings. And then earlier this year, Ofcom in the UK published another report about online violent content among children, whose findings are equally concerning. This was mostly based on interviews with young people. And they concluded that children describe violent content as unavoidable online, that teenage boys are more likely to share violent material to fit in with their peers. This is a really important point that I'll come back to. Recommender algorithms and group messaging fuel exposure, no surprises there. And children are unwilling to report harmful content because they're undermined by trust in the process. Again, this backs up all of the research, all of the findings that we know already. But these findings regarding the extent of violent content are also quite surprising. And all of this is before we even mention pornography. But I found some of the citations, some of the quotes from the study are quite interesting, in that you can see young people here very aware of the toxicity and the harmful nature of the content that's been fed to them, but they're also trying to grapple with the algorithm. I mean, we're all trying to grapple with the algorithm. These are black boxes. The reason why we have to do these experimental studies is because the social media companies won't let us know how the algorithm works. And some people are even proposing that some of the social media companies don't really know how their algorithm works anymore, because it's kind of out of control almost. But I'm not sure I buy that. I think most of them do know, but they won't share this information with us. But I think this is really interesting in terms of, the kind of knowledge of the technology and the willingness or the desire to know more about how the algorithms work. One girl, 14, says, I think there's more of this at night. Another one, I feel like bullying would be easier online, etc. So there's a real engagement there with the technological affordances of the platforms, and a desire for this, in these quotes, I think, for this to be reined in by the social media companies. And as I say, this is before we even start talking about young people's exposure to pornography, which increasingly is becoming, the tendency, the sheer quantity of material that can be accessed for free is obviously an issue already, but also the increasing levels of misogynistic and violent and degrading forms of pornography that are now simply accepted as kind of mainstream pornography rather than any kind of niche pornography is a major issue. So for a while, for a long time, if you're a feminist academic working in the media space, media studies space, it was really, really difficult to critique pornography because you would be branded as sex negative or prudish or whatever. Its advocates were adamant that fantasy and reality were strictly divorced. But a number of recent developments, I think, have turned the tide on this. So the first is obviously the widespread accessibility of porn, thanks to the internet and the fact that children and young people, we know, are accessing pornography from the age of 8, probably average age 12 though. The increasingly violent and misogynistic nature of most of this mainstream porn, but most importantly, young people speaking out about the impact that it's having on their lives, their relationships and their self-esteem. So reports like this that came out in Ireland just earlier this year are, providing really important evidence now, and it's coming from young people. It's not coming from older people who could be accused of being, sex negative or whatever. This is young people, not just women. A lot of women saying that, that this has really negatively impacted their self-esteem and their relationships, but also boys and men talking about how problematic their relationship with pornography has been and how it makes them feel, really complex feelings of shame from being aroused by violence, for example, at the age of 12. And Gail Dines, again, an anti-pornography feminist who for a long time has been considered, kind of extreme. And I showed this TED talk of hers, What Does It Mean to Grow Up in a Pornified Culture, to my undergraduate students just last Monday, to see if they would think that this is an example of a kind of moral panic discourse, or to see, how they would engage with her TED talk. And it was really interesting because these are third-year undergrads, so they're just about to graduate. They found it really compelling, and they said that they couldn't really disagree with anything that she said. And it was the guys in the class in particular, which I was surprised by, who agreed with what she had to say about how damaging it is for young boys in particular, children, 11, 12, to be watching violent pornography and for this to be their first exposure to sex. This is basically their sex education, and it is sex education for many people, and how they really grappled with the complex feelings that this brings up, the kind of cognitive dissonance of arousal, shame, fear, anger, etc., that they're simply not ready to deal with. And arguably, why should anybody see, the degradation and physical abuse of women as somehow sexually normal, never mind an 11-year-old. So I found that really interesting, that they were very kind of on board with Gail Dines' critique, and very supportive of everything she had to say. So the tide is turning among young people on this, is my feeling. So overall, I guess, this is a fairly bleak and disturbing picture. And, there's loads of other problems that are rampant online that we haven't even mentioned, like racism, homophobia, transphobia, the rise of the far right that's associated with all of those things. But I think it's undeniable that most of this harmful content that we're talking about is deeply gendered, and it's deeply invested in restoring outmoded gender hierarchies. Because what we're seeing over and over again in all of this content is misogyny is becoming increasingly mainstreamed and normalized as a result of its amplification on mainstream platforms. The sexual subjugation of women is becoming increasingly mainstream and normalized. And recent surveys in a number of countries show that young women, while they're moving to the left or towards liberal patterns of voting, young men are increasingly moving to the right. We see this in the recent, the results of the recent US elections. So this is a much bigger issue. It's a much bigger issue of our democracy. It's not just about individual harms to individual people. It's a massive societal and structural and political issue. So let's get back to what can we do about it. So for starters, yes, obviously to all of the shorter term urgent measures that that we need. Yes, to stricter and more sophisticated content moderation. Of course, this is urgently needed. But the focus on content is quite problematic. And, you know, this came up in our conversations after our report was published with TikTok and with YouTube Shorts, because they wanted to keep the conversation. These were very fraught meetings that we had with them, because our report received a lot of media attention. And in these discussions, they were very, very keen to keep the focus on content moderation, which is a kind of distraction from the fact that what we're talking about here is the algorithm. We're talking about the content that you're recommending and feeding into somebody's feed, you know, 24/7. It's not the content itself, because most of this content is borderline. It doesn't violate their community standards. A lot of the Andrew Tate type stuff, because Andrew Tate is only one of many manfluencers, right? This content doesn't actually violate their community standards necessarily. That's not the point. So they were saying, well, we've removed Tate from TikTok, we've removed Tate from YouTube Shorts, and we were saying, well, hang on, he came up 582 times in our YouTube Shorts data set. That's 582 Tate videos. And he came up 92 times in our TikTok data set. So it doesn't matter that you've closed his account. You've closed his account, but you haven't removed his content, because it just keeps circulating and being re-amplified by micro-influencers all the time. And whatever algorithms you're using, you're not capturing this. So, you know, content moderation is a bit of a distraction, and it took like 2-hour discussion and a lot of, you know, stress to really get YouTube Shorts to acknowledge that it's not about content moderation. It's about the algorithm. It's what you're feeding people, and how that feed over time, over a relatively short space of time, changes their perception of the world, of relationships, of gender. It starts to normalize and simplify and make sense of a very complex world in ways that are attractive. I mean, they're inaccurate, but they're attractive if you're confused. That's the problem. So, you know, yes, we need content moderation, but it's not going to solve the problem. Yes to the DSA, absolutely, of course. Yes to tighter national legislation on online harms and hate speech, of course. Yes to increased pressure on the tech giants. Although, you know, what's happening at the moment, I think is quite concerning, because if they don't comply now, as the Commissioner mentioned, what we're seeing is that countries' response is going to be to ban social media for under 16s. And the result of this is that, one, children suffer. You know, they're the victims in this if they're shut out of social media. Social media is not like an online experience that we can switch in and out of. These, you know, the offline and the online are completely psychically, affectively intertwined. There's no distinction, there's no meaningful distinction between them. So young people, you know, this is where young people live and communicate and learn, and they have a right to that. And they're the ones who are going to suffer from this if these bans go ahead. And it also means that the VLOPs, the very large online platforms, basically get off the hook. Their problem is solved. So this is not a solution. It's not an empowering solution, and it's not a solution that is any way attuned to young people's digital rights or any kind of sense of digital democracy or digital citizenship. It's a very problematic response, I think. And yes, of course, to safety by design principles embedded in product development. All of these are massively important. But none of these, except maybe the last one, actually addresses the deeper structural problems and crises that have given rise to all of these phenomena in the first place. For example, the unfettered rise of techno-capitalism, which has enabled a minority of tech oligarchs and strongman politicians to basically seize global wealth and power. A crisis of connection and a crisis of empathy among boys and men, caused not by feminism or by minority rights, but by the persistent pressure on men to adopt performances and behaviours of masculinity that harm not only others, but also themselves. Lack of critical digital literacy, which we all need, not just young people, to negotiate this new digital world, and inadequate relationships and sexuality education. And I would argue that our educational systems in their current form are simply unable to tackle the scale and complexity of these problems because they've split knowledge into tightly focused disciplinary subjects, and because a points-driven system of competitive individualism dominates. So there's little or no space in the curriculum for the really large-scale level of joined-up thinking that we need to embrace here. But critical digital literacy has to be our starting point. And, you know, the young people who spoke before alluded to this. Most young people are highly digitally literate in that they know their way around social media. You know, they're very adept users of social media. But there's a huge difference between this and critical digital literacy. So how many young people, or how many people, I'm not picking on young people, how many people are knowledgeable about the history and political economy of the internet and social media? Who owns the platforms? What their business model is? Who's the product? How much profit do they make? Who's exploited? What do they do with their data, or with our data? And why does this matter? This is really important. Why does it matter what they do with your data? It really matters. How do their algorithmic architectures work? And in fairness, as I said earlier, none of us know this, which is why we have to do the kinds of user-centered experiments that we've been doing. All of the same questions, by the way, need to be asked of the porn industry. This is a kind of political economy perspective that looks at ownership and power. And when you start asking those kinds of questions, or when you start asking what kind of sexual scripts dominate pornography, you get a really good analysis of how power, you know, works in this industry. It's not a moral analysis. You don't need to do a moral analysis. If you just look at political economy and power and representational politics within, you know, the films, you're already doing a really kind of critical analysis of a very, very problematic industry. The ways in which bad actors spread disinformation, how to fact check, what are reliable sources? If you're using TikTok as your news source, how do you fact check? How do you follow things up? How many people know this? How to do this properly? What's peer-reviewed mean? How do you access peer-reviewed journal articles, for example? How does the influencer economy actually work? Well, we know kind of at one level how it works culturally, but how does it work economically? What are its business models, its sponsors, the manipulative strategies that it uses to secure attention? The biases that are encoded into AI. To what extent are people aware of this? The unsuitability of privately owned for-profit corporations taking over all aspects of our lives to the point that the very idea of publicly owned or shared space is being eroded. And finally, there's loads more questions. These are just questions off the top of my head, obviously. But finally, whether ethical capitalism or ethical techno-capitalism is possible. Those are the conversations we need to be having. But that brings us out of, a kind of simplistic online, offline, less screen time will solve, the issues, because it won't. Because when we come out of our screens, we're still living in a techno-capitalist world where the distribution of power has never been so unequal. The problems are not resolved. The internet we get from a techno-capitalist economy is the internet we get. It's a side effect. And somebody said recently to me, I sit on the online health task force in Ireland, and somebody said in a meeting recently that strategically they felt that educational solutions are not the way to go because they're too slow and they're not very effective. And that proposing education as the solution is exactly what the tech companies want to hear. And he had a point, because it kind of is, because it's like, yeah, education, takes ages. Governments won't fund it anyway, right? They won't train teachers, they won't put in the resources, etc. But I disagree with this. Because critical digital literacy is not just about how young people consume, it's also about educating and empowering them to be creators. So young people are the coders, the app designers, the policymakers, the legislators of the future. And giving them the intellectual, critical and creative tools to reimagine social media and indeed the world is an urgent task of critical digital media literacy. It's not just about how to use and consume. We've been forced into this very passive idea, and the algorithm model of TikTok, just feeding, entertaining, is encouraging increased passivity in our social media use. It doesn't have to be like that. We can be much more creative, engaged social media users, but we have to reimagine what social media is. So while safety must always remain paramount, I think in the longer term, we really do need to shift the paradigm, or at least to create the conditions in which it's possible to shift the paradigm from one of protectionism to one of empowerment, and from one of digital risk to one of digital ethics, and from one of digital consumerism to one of digital citizenship. And it might take some time for our formal education systems to embrace that kind of paradigm shift, the kind of shift that I'm proposing here. But in the meantime, I hope that some of these considerations might be useful to those of us who are charged with putting out fires on a daily basis, but still believe that more radical, preventive change and empowering change is possible. Thank you.
So really, thanks Debbie Ging for this amazing beginning with this very, very interesting keynote. Really, thank you so much. For questions about the keynote for people in presence and online, we will have them after the panel that our colleagues Dia and Joao will share with. And so we give the floor to Dia and Joao. Please come here and take the floor. So a big applause to them too. And they will share with a multiple of other panelists so available the next panel, which will be finding the balance between protection and environment.